The British Royal Guard, who prepared for King Charles III's coronation, months of drill, discipline, and unbreakable duty. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, and Daniel Harlow read it 3 times before he put it down. He was sitting on the edge of his bunk in the barracks at Wellington Barracks, London, still in his training clothes, still breathing hard from the morning run. The envelope was plain white. The words inside were not long. They told him, in the flat and formal language the British Army uses for everything from promotions to punishments, that he had been selected to form part of the ceremonial guard for the coronation of King Charles III. His role would begin immediately. His availability for the next 6 months was no longer his own. He put the letter on his knee. He looked at the wall across from him, which was painted the color of old chalk, and he sat very still for a moment, that stretched longer than a moment usually does. There was no one else in the room. The other men were at breakfast. The barracks had that particular morning quiet that exists in the 20 minutes between the end of one thing and the beginning of the next, and Daniel sat inside it without moving and read the letter a 4th time. Daniel was 24 years old. He had grown up in Stoke-on-Trent, a city in the Midlands of England that most people knew only from a map, if they knew it at all. It was not the kind of city that appeared in stories about Britain, not in the kind of stories that involved grand events or historic buildings, or the particular golden light that certain parts of the country seemed to photograph in when the rest of the country was under gray. It was the kind of city where people lived because they had always lived there, where the streets were plain and the winters were steady, and the expectation passed quietly down through generations was that you would work hard and keep going and not make too much noise about the difficulty of either. His father, George Harlow, had spent 22 years working at a ceramics factory on the eastern edge of the city. He operated the same machine for most of those years and knew its sounds and rhythms the way a musician knows an instrument that has become an extension of the hand rather than something separate from it. He came home each evening with clay dust worked into the creases of his hands that no amount of washing ever fully removed, and he sat in his chair and watched the evening news and said little, and the quietness of him was not indifference but the specific quietness of a man who has spent his words and his energy in one place for 10 hours and is carefully resting them. When the factory closed, the redundancy money lasted 8 months. The bills did not stop at 8 months. His mother, Patricia, had worked part-time at a supermarket for as long as Daniel could remember. She stood at the checkout and processed the items and said the right things to the people on the other side of the belt, and came home, smelling faintly of the cleaning product they used on the floors, always sitting down in the kitchen chair with the particular and specific tiredness of a woman who has been on her feet all day and will be on them again tomorrow, without complaint and without performance. She was not the complaining kind. She was the kind of person who absorbed difficulty without making it a topic, who managed the household and kept the visible surface of things steady, regardless of what was happening beneath, and who had never, in Daniel's memory, described this as an achievement or expected it to be acknowledged as one. Daniel had joined the army 3 years earlier, not because he had always dreamed of it, not because of a relative in uniform or a recruiting poster or a moment of patriotic feeling while watching something on television. He had joined because the options in Stoke had narrowed into a corridor, and the army was the only door at the end of it that opened from the inside. He had passed his selection with scores that were solid without being exceptional, completed his basic training with the same reliable and unspectacular competence, and been assigned to the 1st Battalion Coldstream Guards, one of the 5 regiments that formed the Household Division, the soldiers responsible for protecting the royal family and performing the great ceremonial duties that the rest of the world associated with the most formal and enduring image of Britain. He had served for 2 years without incident. He was regarded, by the people who wrote such things into documents, as reliable and precise and quiet. Not brilliant, not the kind of soldier whose name was mentioned when people discussed talent in the way that makes other soldiers take note, but the kind who arrived on time and completed what he was assigned and did not give anyone a reason to remember him in a negative way. In the Household Division, that counted for considerably more than most people outside of it would ever have reason to understand. Now he had been selected for the biggest ceremonial event in British life in 70 years. He folded the letter carefully along its original lines. He placed it inside the pocket of his training jacket, against his chest. He laced his boots, stood up, went back outside into the February cold, and completed the second half of his scheduled morning run without saying a word to any of the men running in the formation around him about what was sitting in the pocket over his heart. That evening, after dinner and kit check, he called his mother. The phone rang 4 times before she answered, which was the normal number. Patricia Harlow was always in the middle of something. He could hear the television in the background, the quiz show with the fast questions that she had watched every night for as long as he could remember. The one where the studio lighting made the world inside it look as if it was operating with more electricity than the rest of the world. He asked how his father was doing. She said about the same, which meant the back was still causing problems, and the medication was still expensive, and the improvement was still the measured, partial kind that required patience and gratitude for small steps. He listened and asked the questions that showed he had been listening. He asked about the dog belonging to the neighbor on the left side of the house, which had been tunneling under the garden fence for 3 weeks, and Patricia had been conducting a patient campaign to address. She told him about it at length and with detail. He laughed where laughing was appropriate. Then she mentioned, in the conversational way she mentioned things she had been thinking about, that she had seen something on the news that day. They were already beginning to talk about the preparations for the coronation, the plans for the procession routes and the logistics of Westminster Abbey, and the scale of what was being assembled across London. She said it looked impressive even at this stage. She said the soldiers in the tall black hats always made her think of him when she saw them on television, ever since he had first joined up and she had watched the changing of the guard on a news program and thought, that is what my Daniel does now. He paused for a fraction of a second. Then he said training had been the same as usual. She asked if he was eating properly. He said he was. She said his father had asked after him and had told her specifically to pass on that Daniel should not work too hard, which was the instruction his father gave when he was worried about someone and needed to express it through its opposite. She asked, just before the end of the call, in the casual manner she used for things that were not actually casual, did soldiers like him ever get involved in events like the coronation? Was that the kind of thing they did? He said he didn't know yet. He hung up. He sat in the narrow corridor outside the barrack room with his back against the cold painted wall and his phone face down on his knee. He thought about the fact that he had just told his mother an untruth about something he was proud of, and he could not explain clearly to himself why he had done it. He was not ashamed of the coronation. He was not ashamed of anything connected to it. There was something else present in the lie, something only partially formed, something to do with what it meant for a Harlow from Stoke to be chosen for this particular thing, something living in the gap between pride and the old, inherited uncertainty of not quite knowing where a person like him was supposed to position himself in a story as large and as formal as the one he had just been asked to be part of. He sat in the corridor until the hum of the lights became something he was no longer noticing. Then he went to bed. The following morning, at 5:47, he was issued his ceremonial kit for the first time. The bearskin cap was placed in his hands by the quartermaster, Corporal Andrew Finch, a methodical and unhurried man who handled every piece of ceremonial equipment with the care of someone who understood that these items belonged to an institution considerably older and larger than any individual currently holding them. The cap was heavier than Daniel had expected. He had been given the approximate weight in the briefings. There was a meaningful difference between knowing a number and holding the thing the number described. He turned the cap once in his hands, slowly, the way you handle something that is not yours but has been entrusted to you, something you are being asked to be the temporary steward of, rather than the owner. Then he put it on. He caught his reflection in the long mirror at the far end of the stores room. He did not recognize himself immediately. The cap added height and added something else that was harder to name precisely, some quality of belonging to a longer history than any single person contained inside it. The ordinary face he had brought with him from Stoke looked back from inside something that had existed since long before him and would continue long after. He stood in front of that reflection for a moment that lasted 4 seconds. Then Corporal Finch told him to sign the inventory form. He signed it. He handed the cap back for storage until it was needed. He walked out into the cold February morning and began the first day of coronation preparation. There were 47 other guardsmen who had received similar letters. They came from different battalions, different parts of the country, different personal histories for having ended up in a uniform. In the household division, you learned to stand beside people for extended periods before you learned their names. The standing came first. Everything else came after, if it came at all. The drill sergeant was Color Sergeant Neil Burkett, 19 years in the division, the kind of authority that does not need to announce itself because it is simply present in the way light is present, not stated but evident. His voice filled whatever space it entered without any apparent effort. He told them on the first morning what was expected, what would be trained, and what the standard was. The standard was perfect, not close to perfect, not good enough for the circumstances. Perfect. The kind that required every boot to strike the road at precisely the same moment, every rifle at the same angle down to the degree, every head at the same regulated height, every pair of eyes fixed at the same point in the middle distance regardless of what sound or movement was happening anywhere else. The kind that, when it was genuinely achieved, created something greater than 48 people standing in a line. The kind that made large crowds fall silent for a moment they could not account for. Daniel listened to every word. He went to sleep that first night with the weight of the bearskin still living in the memory of his hands, the specific sensory knowledge of it, the way you remember the feel of something that mattered long after you have put it down. He lay in his bunk and thought about the 6 months ahead of him, and his father's bad back, and the letter in his jacket pocket, and the ordinary face in the mirror, in the stores room, that had been briefly surrounded by something ancient. He thought, this is real. Not in the general sense in which most things are technically real, in the specific sense, the sense that matters. Then he closed his eyes, because tomorrow would begin at 5:47, and the standard would be there waiting exactly where it had been left. Outside, London continued in the way London always continued, enormous and indifferent, and full of people pursuing their own lives, none of them aware that in a set of barracks near Buckingham Palace, a young man from Stoke-on-Trent was lying quietly in the dark with a letter over his heart and a weight in his hands that had not yet found its full meaning. It would find it. Everything that mattered did, given time and the right kind of patience. It would find all of it. The cold in February had no interest in ceremony or in the importance of what was being prepared inside it. It arrived on the parade ground each morning before the men did, and stayed through the hours of drill with the patient permanence of something that had been doing this since long before any particular group of soldiers came and expected to be ready after that. By the end of the first week, Daniel had stopped experiencing the cold as a condition to be noted, and had begun to experience it simply as the texture of a certain kind of morning, the mornings that meant something was real. He was on the square by 5:55 each day without exception, 8 minutes before the official start time. Color Sergeant Burkett had said on the opening morning that a man who arrived on time was already late. This was the kind of declaration that drill sergeants made as a matter of institutional habit, the inherited language of military mornings. Daniel had decided to take it at its complete intended value, because the things an institution said as habit often contained a genuine instruction if you applied them without modification and without looking for the edge of what they required. The drill in the early weeks was built on repetition so thorough and so consistent that it eventually stopped feeling like repetition and began to feel like acquisition, the body learning a new language, the movements becoming vocabulary spoken below the level of conscious thought. Left foot, right foot, the rifle at the precise angle, the elbow at its exact position, the chin level, the eyes committed to the fixed point in the middle distance. Not performed, spoken, the way a person speaks a language they have learned so deeply that they no longer need to translate anything before they say it. The hardest element of ceremonial drill, Daniel learned, was not the physical one, though the physical was real and accumulated with every hour and did not offer any softening because the occasion was important or the preparation was patriotic. After 3 hours standing at attention, The muscles in the lower back initiated what could only be described as a direct and persistent communication with the brain. After 4 hours, the feet, compressed into ceremonial boots, built with the priorities of appearance firmly ahead of the priorities of human comfort, developed positions on their situation that grew more detailed and more emphatic as the morning extended. After 5 hours, the neck had a fully formed critical view of the 1.5-pound bearskin sitting on top of it, and it was not a view that would have been published in a supportive periodical. None of this was permitted to show on any surface that anyone could see. This was the interior part of the training, the part that could not be addressed by the same methods as rifle angles or the timing of boot strikes. It lived below the visible soldier, in the private management of everything the body generated that could not be acted on, in the ongoing and deliberate process of acknowledging each complaint in full and then deciding not to respond to it, placing it to one side in the way you place a document you have read and noted and will not be answering. Daniel found, over the course of the first 3 weeks, that he had a capacity for this discipline that he had not previously known about. He found it the way you find things you did not know you had, by being placed in a situation that requires them and discovering that something in you already knows the procedure. He had spent his entire life watching his mother perform a version of this every day, standing at a checkout for 8 hours, holding the surface steady while managing everything beneath it, coming home and making dinner and asking about other people's days, and never once presenting her own day as something requiring management or accommodation. He had never thought of it as a skill. He had never thought of it as discipline or training or anything other than simply what she was. But standing on a cold parade ground at 6 in the February morning, managing a back that was introducing itself to him with considerable specificity, he thought about his mother for the first time in a way that felt different from how a son usually thinks about his mother. He thought, she has been doing a harder version of this every single day for 30 years, and nobody built a system around it, and nobody scheduled it at 5:47 in the morning, and nobody called it discipline or training or something that earned a name. He kept this thought to himself. It would have been genuinely difficult to explain in the language of the parade ground. He thought sometimes during the long-standing rehearsals about what it was that made one man better at stillness than another. It was not a question with an obvious answer. You might assume it was the men with the most physical strength, the ones whose bodies were built to endure, but physical strength was only part of it, and not the most significant part. The men who held the longest without the cost showing on the surface were often the ones who had learned, before the army, to manage something else entirely. Not pain or fatigue, which were simple problems with simple solutions, but the more complicated problem of continuing to function while carrying something that you could not put down and could not show to anyone. Connolly, from Liverpool, was one of the best at it. He had a stillness during the long sessions that was almost architectural, a quality of simply being there that most men had to actively maintain, but that Connolly seemed to inhabit. Daniel had asked him once, during a brief break on a cold morning in March, what he thought about during the standing. Connolly had considered this with the seriousness of a man asked a real question. He said, "I think about the fact that it's going to end, not the coronation. This morning, whatever is happening right now is going to stop eventually. I think about that." Daniel had thought about this answer for weeks. He had thought about the idea that the most useful thing you could hold in your mind during something difficult was not its significance or its purpose or its eventual reward, but its simple finitude, the fact that it would end, that all things ended, that the present moment was not permanent. He had tried this during the long April rehearsals. It had worked, in the way that most things worked when they were the right tool for the actual problem. He did not think about the coronation while he was standing. He thought about the next scheduled break, and then, when the break came, about the next section of the rehearsal, and then about the end of the morning, and then about dinner, and then about sleep, and then about the fact that tomorrow's 5:47 would also end, because everything ended, because nothing in the army or anywhere else lasted forever, and the endurance required was not endless endurance, but the specific duration of this specific morning, and that was always, eventually, manageable. By the 3rd week, The formation had begun to take on a shape. Not the finished shape, not what it would need to be, but the early structure of it, the way scaffolding shows the intention of the building before any of the walls have arrived. Color Sergeant Burkett walked the line each morning with the unhurried attention of a man who could find a 2-centimeter deviation in shoulder height from 15 feet while maintaining full awareness of everything else within 30 meters of him. He found corrections to make most mornings, always specific, always quiet, never needing to be made the same way twice. He stopped in front of Daniel on the 7th morning and looked at his left shoulder without speaking. Then he said, in the volume he used for things that needed saying once and once only, "Your left shoulder is dropping on the 3rd count. Not much. Enough." Daniel corrected it immediately. Burkett moved on without another word, which in the household division meant the observation was complete. That evening, Daniel stood in front of the bathroom mirror for 40 minutes drilling the correction. He watched the shoulder in the glass, repeating the movement with the focused and perhaps slightly disproportionate attention of a man who has decided that this 1 millimeter is the entire matter. A grown man in a tiled room at 9 in the evening watching his own shoulder the way you watch something that has been making a small error for long enough that the small error has become the main subject. The next morning, the shoulder dropped on the 3rd count. He corrected it that evening, and the evening after that, and the evening after that. On the 12th morning, the body corrected the shoulder before the mind got around to issuing an instruction. The movement had migrated below conscious attention and become automatic, which was precisely the place all of the training was building toward. Not correctness performed by a person making an active decision, correctness expressed by a body that had learned what to do and did it. It was in the 4th week that he first had a real conversation with Corporal Marcus Webb. Webb was 29, from Brixton in South London, 7 years in the Coldstream Guards. He moved through the drill with the economy of someone who had done a thing long enough that it no longer cost him anything visible. The movements clean and complete, the stillness during the standing phases absolute in the way that absolute stillness is only available to people who have stopped fighting against it. He was not unfriendly, but he was precise in where he placed his attention, in the way that long-serving soldiers often become precise about everything, because experience teaches you that attention is a finite resource, and some destinations are more useful than others. They were standing at ease during a 10-minute break, both with water bottles, when Webb said without looking at Daniel, "You were corrected on the shoulder again this morning, 3rd consecutive session." Daniel said he knew. Webb said, "But you're fixing it the right way. You're not just adjusting the angle, you're building it into something that will hold without you thinking about it. Keep doing it exactly as you're doing it." Daniel said he would. Then, after a pause that felt natural rather than uncertain, he asked Webb how he managed the interior of it. Not the mechanics, not the angle or the timing, the hours of it. Webb was quiet for a moment, turning the water bottle slowly in his hands. Then he said the thing that Daniel would return to, more times than he had expected to. He said, "The only way to survive the coronation is to not be there. You are a pillar. Pillars do not experience things. That is the job." Daniel looked at him. Webb was already looking back at the parade ground, his attention somewhere interior that was not the parade ground at all, which was a demonstration of the thing he was describing. Daniel said, "What does that mean precisely? Not be there?" Webb said, "It means your body is there, your eyes are there, your uniform is there and doing exactly what it needs to do. But you," a pause, "you find a place inside yourself that is neutral, not interesting, not emotional, neutral. You stay there for as long as the occasion requires. You come back when it is finished." He turned and looked at the parade ground. Daniel stood beside him and thought about what he had said for the rest of the day, and for several days after. By March, the rehearsals had expanded in scope. Individual battalion work gave way to combined training that integrated different units representing different sections of the route. By April, they were conducting full-scale rehearsals on closed sections of the mall, before the city woke up each morning, the streets held empty by the police, while the formations moved through them at the pace of the actual procession. while officers with clipboards noted the 100 small adjustments required to turn a collection of well-trained individuals into a single ceremonial object moving through the capital of the country. The horses joined the rehearsals in late March, and the first time Daniel stood his position while cavalry moved at speed 20 feet behind him, the sound registered as something he had not fully anticipated. He held. He had been built, by this point, to hold. One morning in April, a seagull landed on the ceremonial sword being carried by Guardsman Peter Connolly, 2 positions to Daniel's right. Connolly was from Liverpool, solid and good-natured, 4 years in the regiment, a man who regarded most things that happened during drill as simply further information about the world that needed to be processed and filed and responded to with minimum drama. The seagull sat on the sword with the indifference of a creature with no understanding of ceremony and no investment in the plans of any particular morning. Neither Daniel nor Connolly moved. The seagull observed its situation with a calm and detached interest, found it acceptable, and eventually departed. Connolly, still forward, murmured, "Happens." Daniel murmured back, "Does it?" Connolly said, "Third time for me. Last time it was a pigeon, stayed nearly 2 minutes. I won a small amount of money off it." And then the silence resumed, because the drill required it, and the seagull had been fully accounted for. By late April, Marcus Webb and Daniel had settled into the specific kind of friendship available to 2 men in that regiment, which developed through proximity and shared understanding, and the occasional exchange of something genuine beneath the formality of the structure above it. One evening, walking back from the last rehearsal of the day, Webb told Daniel that he had watched the trooping of the color on television as a child in Brixton, and had thought the men in the bearskin hats were not ordinary men but a kind of permanent installation, like the stone lions in Trafalgar Square, present and immovable and belonging to a different register of existence than the people watching them. Daniel said, "And then you became one." Webb said, "And then I became one. And from the inside, you have a bad knee, and you are thinking about whether there is pasta left in the kitchen." Daniel said, "And from the outside?" Webb said, "From the outside, you are the architecture. You hold the shape of the occasion so that everyone else can be inside it." He went in. Daniel stood outside for a moment. He thought about holding the shape of an occasion so that other people could be inside it. He thought about his mother at the checkout, who had been doing exactly that every working day for as long as he could remember, holding the shape of the transaction, of the interaction, of the smooth and expected surface of a service that 100 people needed to move through each hour, so that each of those 100 people could complete their errand and go on with their day, and never have to think about what the holding cost the person doing it. He made a mental note to ask her about it someday. He thought about what Webb had said, about what kind of man he had decided to be. He thought about this in the days between Webb's words and the coronation, turning it over the way you turn over something that has arrived at the right moment and needs time to find its full meaning. He did not think Webb meant that the decision had been made consciously, as a deliberate choice on a specific day. He thought Webb meant something closer to what Daniel had come to understand about the shoulder correction, the 12 evenings in front of the mirror, the shoulder that had eventually stopped dropping not because Daniel decided it would stop, but because the correction had become the only movement the body knew. Some decisions were not events. They were accumulations. They were the weight of every smaller choice, stacked over time, until the stack was tall enough to be called a character. He thought, if that is the kind of man I am, I did not make him alone. He thought about the factory, and the checkout, and the chair beside the hospital bed. He thought about the thing passed down through the Harlow family without a name, the specific quality of continuing under the weight of things that did not ease, of managing the interior while keeping the exterior steady, of not requiring the difficulty to be acknowledged before you found a way through it. He thought about how this quality had arrived in him without his knowing it was arriving, the way most important things arrive, quietly, through the sustained example of people who were simply doing what the situation required. He was ready for the morning, more than ready. He was what all of this had been building toward, without anyone having quite planned it that way, which was the best kind of building, the kind that produces something that surprises you with its solidity when you put the full weight on it. He went inside, he checked his kit, he set his alarm, he closed his eyes. The mornings continued. The standard did not move. The shoulder held. 3 weeks before the coronation, at 11 minutes past 9 on a Wednesday morning, Daniel's phone vibrated in his pocket during a scheduled equipment check. He should not have had it on him. It was a minor rule, and it was observed inconsistently. He carried the phone because his father's health had been unpredictable for the past year, and he preferred to be reachable, a quiet, practical decision he had not mentioned to anyone because it required no announcement. He felt the vibration and ignored it because the equipment check needed his attention. It vibrated a second time, then a third, within 60 seconds of the second. 3 calls in rapid succession was the pattern his mother used only when something was happening that could not wait for a later return call. He stepped to the edge of the store's room and answered. Patricia was calm in the specific way she was calm when managing something serious. The calm of a woman who had decided long ago that adding her own distress to a situation already carrying sufficient distress served no one. She began with something that was not the main thing, which was her consistent pattern. She mentioned the weather. She mentioned that the front garden gate was sticking, and then, in the same measured tone she had used for the weather and the gate, "Your dad had a bit of a turn last night. His heart. They took him into hospital around midnight." Daniel stood still with his back to the room. He asked if his father was all right. She said the doctors were calling it a minor cardiac event, that he was awake and alert, and had already been arguing with a nurse about whether he was well enough to walk to the bathroom on his own, which she reported with a brief laugh that arrived and departed quickly, a laugh that was doing more work than laughs usually have to carry. She said, "He told me not to call you. He said you'd worry, and there was nothing you could do from London, and he didn't want you distracted." Daniel said, "You should always call me." She said, "I know." And she was quiet for a moment, and in that silence he could hear the hospital around her, the intercom calling someone to a different floor, the measured footsteps of people who moved through those corridors every day and knew them the way people know all familiar territories, without looking at them. The particular ambient quality of a place where people sit with things outside their control. He told her he would sort something out. She told him there was no need for that. He said he was not being dramatic. He was being practical. She said his father would be very annoyed if Daniel rearranged everything for something the doctors had already said was minor. Daniel said his father's position on the matter had been noted and was in the record. After the call, he stood in the store's room facing the wall for 60 seconds, not for drama, because he needed 60 seconds for the information to settle before he decided what to do with it. He already knew what he was going to do. He had known while she was still talking. He needed the 60 seconds not to decide but to look at the decision honestly, to know the full weight of what it meant before he carried it. He knocked on the door of Regimental Sergeant Major Callum Price. Price was 51 years old and had spent 28 of those years in the division, and had the particular face that develops over many years of receiving things that require a measured response, a face that had not unlearned the capacity for feeling, but had learned to receive feeling without performing it. He listened to Daniel without interrupting. He asked one question: was the prognosis considered life-threatening? Daniel said the medical assessment was minor. Price nodded once. Then he explained the options in the clean, direct language he used for things that required no softening but deserved to be said clearly and without omission. Compassionate leave was available. It was Daniel's by right. It would not appear in his record as anything other than what it was. He should, however, understand that at 3 weeks before the event, with the detail at this stage of its preparation, the logistical reality was that removal from his position was operationally final. The reserve would fill his place. This was not a consequence or a punishment. It was the mechanics of an event at this scale operating at this stage. He said all of this and then left the space required. Daniel said, "I'll stay, sir." Price looked at him for a moment, not with approval and not with judgment, but with the level and accurate attention of a man watching a decision being made and recording it properly. He said, "I'll note the circumstances." A pause. I hope your father makes a full recovery." Daniel thanked him. He walked the length of the corridor and pushed through the far door into the gray morning and stood on the pavement with his hands at his sides for 60 seconds, his face slightly upward toward the overcast sky, holding himself together with the tools he had been building for 6 months, and with certain older tools that predated the army by several years. Then he went back to the equipment check and completed it. That night he lay in his bunk and did not sleep. He looked at the dark above him and thought about his father in a hospital in Stoke, and thought about what it looked like in a hospital in Stoke at 2 in the morning, and thought about the last time he had been inside a hospital in Stoke, which was when he was 11 years old and had broken his arm falling out of a tree at the back of the garden, and his father had driven him in and had stayed all night without sleeping, sitting in the chair beside the bed and occasionally squeezing Daniel's hand and saying in the particular voice he used when he was more worried than he wanted to appear, "All right, lad?" He had stayed. He had not gone home and come back in the morning. He had stayed through the night and been there when it was light and gone to work the following morning on no sleep, and he had not made much of it or mentioned it again. Daniel thought, "I am not going to be there." He sat with this without trying to soften it or improve it. He had made the choice. The choice was real. The choice was the right one for reasons that were also real. A grown man could make a choice of this kind and carry it without pretending it weighed nothing. The fact that it weighed something did not make it the wrong choice. It meant it was a choice that had something to teach him about what he was made of. It weighed something. He carried it. He was still awake when the early light arrived, through the high narrow window at 5:25. He dressed in the dark, carefully and without hurry, and went out to the square. He drilled alone for 25 minutes before anyone else arrived, the cold steady on his face, the left shoulder holding exactly where it was supposed to hold. By the time the other men came out, he was already warm. On the Wednesday of that week, 5 days after his mother's call, he rang the ward directly and asked for his father's room. George answered on the second ring and sounded tired but entirely present, and had been developing, over the preceding 5 days, what appeared to be a comprehensive and increasingly detailed critical framework around the hospital catering. Daniel listened and made the right sounds and asked about the doctors. George described the doctors as cautious men who spoke in qualifications, which he said he respected professionally but found wearing to live alongside. Then, without preamble, his father said, "Your mother tells me what you're working on." Daniel said, "She told you." George said, "She always does, eventually. Part of the arrangement between us, going back a long time." A pause. "Is it the coronation?" Daniel said yes. There was a silence on the line that had a quality to it, not empty but occupied, the kind of silence produced when a feeling arrives that is larger than the container a person usually keeps ready for feelings of that kind, and they need a moment to find the right space for it. George said, "Will you be on the television?" Daniel said he would probably be visible in the broadcast at some point, yes. Another silence. Then his father said it in the voice he used for the things he found hardest to say, the voice stripped to its plainest register, without anything around it. "I'm proud of you, son." Daniel held the phone against his ear and looked at the wall in front of him. He said, "Get better, Dad. I mean it." He ended the call. He sat in the corridor outside his room with his back against the wall and his feet flat on the floor. He looked at the seconds moving on his phone screen. He sat like that for 4 minutes. He did not make any sound. He held everything in its place, the way he had been trained to hold things, and the way his father had taught him to hold things long before any training, with the hands and the stillness and the plain continued presence of a man who stays. Then he got up. He washed his face with cold water. He dried his hands. He looked at himself in the bathroom mirror, the ordinary face, the Stoke face, nothing on top of it today, no bearskin, just Daniel. He put his boots on. He went out to the evening rehearsal and held the line. 2 weeks later, Marcus Webb found him after the final rehearsal before the coronation and walked beside him in the direction of the barracks. They walked in the silence that was their established way of walking together, the silence that had enough content in it not to need filling. Then Webb said, "I heard about your father. I heard you had the option to go." Daniel said his father was going home the following week and that the doctors were satisfied. Webb said, "Good. Then, you stayed." Daniel said, "I stayed." Webb was quiet for a moment. Then, "You know what that tells you, staying when you had a proper reason not to." Daniel said, "The job comes first." Webb looked at him sideways and held his gaze for a moment. He said, "No. It tells you who you already were before any of this started. The coronation doesn't make you into anything. It just confirms what was already built." He went inside. Daniel stood in the evening air and let what Webb had said find its level, the way water finds its level if you give it time and enough room. He thought, "I know what kind of man I was before this started. I grew up watching one." The week that followed the phone call with his father was the strangest week of the 6 months. Not in any outward way that anyone would have noticed, but in the interior quality of it. The texture of moving through each day knowing what he was carrying, and not putting it down, and not showing that he was carrying it. He ran his rehearsals, he held his position, he checked his kit with the same attention he had brought to it every night since February, the same inspection of each element, the same inventory of what was correct and what needed addressing. The routine of it was not a distraction. He had been in the army long enough to understand that routine was not designed to make you forget what you were carrying. It was designed to give you something to hold on to while you carried it, a rope to follow through a place where visibility was poor. He called the hospital every other day. His father answered each time in the voice of a man who was genuinely recovering, who was finding the recovery tedious in the way that healthy men find illness tedious, as an interruption of the normal business of being upright and useful. He complained about the food with increasing creativity. He expressed strong opinions about the television remote, which was kept at a height on the wall bracket that he felt was deliberately inconvenient. He asked Daniel how the training was going. Daniel said it was going well. His father said, "Are you nervous?" Daniel considered this. He said, "No, I don't think so." His father was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Good. There's nothing to be nervous about. You've done the work. The rest is just showing up." Daniel thought about this for the remainder of that day. He thought about it the following day. He thought, "My father, who has never trained for anything, in a building with drill sergeants and bearskins, understands the most important thing about what I am doing. The work is already done. What is left is just showing up. And showing up is the thing the Harlows had always been best at." On the Thursday before the coronation, there was one final full rehearsal on the Mall. It was early morning, the city not yet fully awake, the streets held clear by the same mechanism they had been held clear for the past 6 weeks of rehearsals, and the men moved through the route one last time in the gray pre-dawn light, with the specific awareness that this was the last time before the real thing, the last time the performance would be permitted the status of practice. Daniel had expected this rehearsal to feel different from the others. He had expected some quality of finality to it, some signal from the morning itself that this was the last rehearsal, that after this the next time would count. But it felt exactly the same as every other rehearsal. The cold was the same. The route was the same. His shoulder held the same. The standard was where it had always been, and he held it where it had always been held. He thought, "This is what 6 months of preparation feels like from the inside. It feels like nothing new. It feels like the morning you have been building toward is indistinguishable from all the mornings that built it. And this is correct. This is what preparation is for, not to make the real thing feel special. To make the real thing feel continuous, with all the practice that preceded it, so that the only thing different about it is what is happening outside of you, not what is happening inside. The outside was going to be the coronation. The inside was going to be exactly the same as it had been on every morning for 6 months. He walked back to the barracks after the final rehearsal with the other men and said nothing in particular and ate dinner and checked his kit and laid out his uniform for the morning with the care that the morning deserved, and went to sleep at 9:20. He was not nervous. His father had been right. There was nothing to be nervous about. The work was done. There was one other thing that happened in the week before the coronation that Daniel did not tell anyone about, and that he thought about more than he told himself he was thinking about it. He was walking back from an equipment check on the Tuesday, 4 days before the 6th of May, when he passed a section of the corridor that had a window overlooking the parade ground. He stopped at the window without meaning to stop, without any particular intention, and looked out at the square. It was late afternoon. The light was the thin and slightly golden light of an April evening trying to become a May evening, the kind of light that appears briefly each day at that time of year in London, and is easy to miss if you are going somewhere. The square was empty. No men, no formation, no drill, just the tarmac and the lines that had been drilled into it over decades of men doing what he had been doing for 6 months, and the quiet that accumulates in a space where many repetitions of the same careful thing have taken place. He looked at it for a while. He thought, I have been here every morning at 5:47 for 6 months, and I have never actually seen it empty. I have always arrived when it was already occupied by the work of the morning. He thought about what the square was when there was nobody on it, what it was when it was just a rectangle of tarmac with white lines, before anyone arrived to give it the particular significance that the arriving gave it. He thought, it is just a place. It is a place where people have practiced being what they needed to be, and the practice is done now, and the place continues, and the thing the practice built continues inside the people who did the practicing, and neither of those facts needs the other to remain true. He went back to his duties. He did not mention the window or the square or what he had thought at the window to anyone. But he thought about it again later, on the Mall, in the 3 hours and 22 minutes, in the neutral space inside the stillness. He thought about the empty square and the late afternoon light, and it was a comfortable thing to think about, a thing that did not require management, a thing that simply existed in the place where things that were finished and settled lived. He went inside. He checked his kit. He set his alarm. The morning was coming. The morning of the 6th of May began at 3:45, and it began without ceremony or special announcement, because the army does not mark important mornings differently from ordinary ones. A morning is scheduled, or it is not. This one was scheduled, and the schedule began at 3:45, and the only other thing that needed to be said about its significance was that it existed in the schedule at all. Daniel was already awake when his alarm went off at 3:35. He had been awake since shortly after 2, not with his mind running anxious laps, but with the clean and specific wakefulness of a body that has understood what kind of morning is approaching and has organized itself to meet it. He lay still until the alarm because there was no benefit in beginning before the appointed time, and beginning at the correct time was part of beginning correctly. He dressed in the dark with the care he brought to all things that had consequences. He had laid the uniform out the previous evening with the attention that the evening before always deserved on the morning of something significant, each element in its place, checked and then checked again, because the preparation the night before was the preparation that mattered most when the morning had no room for second thoughts. The bearskin was issued at 4:04 by Corporal Finch, with the same seriousness he brought to every issuing, as if the object were meeting Daniel for the first time rather than the 43rd time. Daniel took it. He held it for a moment. The weight was entirely familiar now in the way that the weight of something becomes familiar when it has lived in the memory of your hands through 6 months of practice, as familiar as the weight of your own 2 hands. He put it on. He joined the formation. They moved out into the London dark. By 8 o'clock they were in position on the Mall. The crowd had been assembling since long before dawn. Daniel had been told about the expected numbers, had understood the scale of it as information, but the difference between knowing something as information and experiencing the thing itself is the difference between reading about the weight of a bearskin and holding one. Walking into position along the Mall with the crowd already dense on both sides of the route was something the briefings had not been able to fully communicate. The sound of it had mass and warmth and the specific quality of a very large number of people who have arrived at the same place at the same time for the same reason, who are aware at some level, not quite conscious of being part of something they believe is genuinely historic. He fixed his eyes at the regulation point. He set his spine. He went to the interior space. He was there. He was not there. Both things were simultaneously true, and both were necessary, and there was no contradiction between them that required any resolution. The wait before the procession reached his position was 51 minutes by the schedule he had memorized. He did not consult a clock. He tracked the time by the changing quality of the crowd sound, by the intervals between the distant sounds of bands and horses advancing up the route, by the gradual shift in the crowd's collective orientation as the procession moved section by section toward them. The rain began at 8:05, light and persistent, the kind of rain that does not fall dramatically but simply exists as a condition, adding a fine and consistent layer of cold to everything already present. It ran down the back of Daniel's neck and found the space between his collar and his skin and continued there. He registered it. He placed it aside. He held. He was aware of the crowd on his left, with the peripheral awareness of a man whose eyes are committed elsewhere, registering the depth of faces and cameras and flags, and the particular collective energy of people who have planned and waited for this. Some of them since the previous evening, some since well before dawn. He was aware of all of it the way a wall is aware of the weather on the other side of it. He was aware of Guardsman Peter Connolly, 2 positions to his right, standing with the complete and apparently effortless stillness of a man who has been doing this long enough that the extraordinary has become simply weather. He was aware of Marcus Webb somewhere further along the line. He was aware of the 43 other men distributed across this section of the route, each one managing whatever was inside him while the exterior stayed fixed and identical and exactly as the occasion required. At 9:23, a sound moved through the crowd from the palace end of the mall. It rolled toward Daniel's position at the speed that news travels through a crowd, which is the fastest speed news ever moves, ahead of the thing that caused it. He did not need to look. The quality of the sound told him everything. He held. The horses reached his section first by sound. The cavalry of the sovereign's escort, the hooves on the road at a weight and rhythm that the rehearsals had made entirely familiar, but which today carried something additional beneath the familiarity, something that came from the occasion itself, from the fact that this was not a rehearsal. They moved through the edge of his fixed gaze. Then, advancing up the mall with the deliberate pace of something that has been built over centuries to be looked at, the gold state coach. It passed 12 feet from where he stood. He did not look at it directly. He was aware of it in the peripheral field, the way you are aware of something very large and very close when your eyes are already committed to a point beyond it. He was aware of its gold, catching the gray morning light and returning it as something warmer. He was aware of the way the crowd's sound escalated as the coach reached his position, rising and then rising again, a sustained and complete sound with no gap in it, the sound of 200,000 people seeing simultaneously the thing they had come to see. He did not move. Inside, in the neutral place, in the interior territory he had been building access to since February, something arrived quietly and without announcement. It did not disrupt the surface of him. It simply appeared, complete and already formed, the way certain thoughts arrive on mornings when you are not trying to think anything in particular. He thought, "Dad, I am 12 feet from the king's coach. I am here. I am on this street, and this is happening, and I stayed, and I am 12 feet away, and you cannot see me, but I am here." He said none of it. He did not alter his expression. He did not shift his weight. He did not let his left shoulder drop. The coach moved on up the mall. The crowd sound followed it in waves, rolling toward Westminster Abbey, filling the space the coach had vacated. Daniel held his position. The rain continued. The morning moved through its scheduled intervals. In a quieter period after the main procession had passed, a small child in a red raincoat appeared in his peripheral field, standing at the barrier directly to his left. The child had a small flag and noticed Daniel and began to wave it at him, not at the procession which had already continued on, at Daniel himself. He did not respond. The child waved with greater purpose, moving the flag in slow, deliberate arcs, with the complete commitment of someone who has not yet encountered the idea that some things in the world cannot be waved at into acknowledgement. The flag went back and forth. The small face was entirely open, waiting. After a period of sustained and earnest waving that produced no response, the child made a practical assessment of the situation and turned back to watch what remained of the procession with the quiet adaptability of a small person who has decided that this particular avenue has closed and another must be tried. Daniel registered all of this in the peripheral field, where everything that was not the regulation point lived today. He held the line. He thought about the child later, on the train to Stoke, and he thought about what it must look like from outside when something does not wave back. He thought it must look like absence, like indifference, like the uniform where you expected a person. He thought that from the inside it was something entirely different, something that required both words and silence to describe properly, the condition of being entirely present and completely contained at the same moment, of holding the whole of what the morning meant inside a surface that showed nothing, not because nothing was there, but because the holding was the job, and the job was the point of all of it. He thought about the rehearsals in a way he had not permitted himself to think about them during the months of preparation. He thought about how each rehearsal had been a kind of reduction, a deliberate narrowing of the self into a function, and how the function was useful precisely because it was narrow, because a man who was only his function could perform it without the noise that a man with the whole of himself active would generate. He thought about how this narrowing was not a loss but a discipline, not a diminishment but a training in the most specific kind of attention, the kind that holds one thing perfectly rather than holding many things adequately. He thought about Colour Sergeant Burkett walking the line every morning. He thought about the way Burkett found the thing that needed correcting without looking for it, the way the trained eye found deviation without effort, the way 19 years of doing this had given him an automatic standard against which everything was measured in real time. Daniel thought, I am 3 years into something that takes 19. He thought about what 19 years of holding the line would put inside a man, what it would build, what it would confirm about what a person was made of by the time they had done it long enough that it was simply who they were. He thought about Marcus Webb saying, "Pillars do not experience things." He had thought about this for months and had arrived, standing here on the Mall with 200,000 people and the King's coach and the rain and the 3 hours, at a different understanding of it from the one he had started with. Webb had not said pillars were empty. He had said pillars did not experience things. A pillar holds weight. The holding is the experience. The weight is what passes through you, what you are made of by the bearing of it, what you know about yourself by the time the structure comes down and you are still standing. Daniel was still standing. 3 hours and 22 minutes. His feet submitted a detailed account of these 3 hours and 22 minutes, beginning in the evening and reaching their most comprehensive statement around midnight. His neck contributed its own testimony. His lower back provided what could fairly be described as formal written evidence submitted in full. None of it had registered on the surface while it was happening. When the stand-down came, and the formation broke, and the day began the long official process of concluding, Daniel stood at ease and breathed with the measured care of a man returning from a long distance to a place closer to ordinary. He looked at the stretch of Mall where the coach had passed 12 feet from where he stood. He thought of his father in a hospital room watching a small television. He thought of the 12 feet, and the corrected shoulder, and the letter in February, and the weight of the bearskin in his hands the first time, and the specific quality of his father's voice going quiet when the most important thing was finally being said. He thought about the scale of what was happening around him in a way that was available to him precisely because he was not watching it directly. This was the strange gift of the neutral place. It allowed a kind of peripheral awareness that was more complete than direct attention, because direct attention narrowed, focused on one thing and excluded others, while the peripheral field held everything simultaneously, without prioritizing any of it. He was aware of the entirety of the occasion, of the depth and the weight of it, of the 200,000 people, and the cameras, and the grey London sky, and the rain, and the horses, and the soldiers, and the coaches, and he was aware of all of it, without looking at any particular part of it, the way you are aware of a room you know well when you enter it in the dark. He thought about the phrase that Webb had used months ago, which he had been carrying in the way you carry a phrase that has arrived before you understand it, and is waiting for the moment that makes it clear. He thought, you are the architecture. You hold the shape of the occasion so that everyone else can be inside it, and he understood now what Webb had meant by this in a way he had only partially understood when the words were first said. You did not participate in the occasion, you made the occasion possible. You were the condition under which everything else happened, and being the condition was not nothing. Being the condition was, in its own way, everything. The Gold State coach had passed. The procession was continuing up the Mall. The ceremony was happening. Daniel was the reason it could. He thought about his father watching a television screen in Stoke-on-Trent, and he thought about the 200,000 people on the Mall, and he thought about the 2 billion people watching on screens across the world, and he thought about all of them watching the thing he was making possible by standing here without moving in the rain, and he thought that none of them could see him any more than they could see the foundations of the building they were standing in. And that was right. That was as it should be. The foundation did not need to be seen. The foundation needed to hold. He held. He turned and followed the formation back and carried the day forward with him, because the most important days are not the ones you leave behind. The train from Euston to Stoke-on-Trent left at 11:07 on the morning, 2 days after the coronation, and Daniel was in the window seat before the doors closed. His bag was in the overhead rack. His phone was off. His hands rested in his lap with the easy weight of hands that have set down something heavy and found that their own weight, without it, is lighter than they remembered. He was wearing his own clothes, jeans and a soft gray jumper, and the trainers he wore when he was not required to be anything particular, and he was comfortable in the specific way you are comfortable in your own clothes, when the alternative has been ceremonial boots and full uniform for a significant portion of the preceding 6 months. He watched England happen outside the window. He had taken this train many times in 3 years, and knew its landscape the way you know any journey you have made repeatedly, not by studying it, but by having it accumulate in you until it becomes part of your geography, the way the shapes of certain hills, and the colors of certain fields, and the way specific towns look from a train window in early May, have all, over time, become part of what you mean when you think of a particular direction. London to Stoke was always a movement between 2 versions of himself, and the 2 versions had not always agreed about which one was more real, and today he was beginning to think the disagreement might be the wrong question. He let the things come in their own order. The letter on a Tuesday morning, the bearskin in his hands for the first time, heavier than expected. The 11 evenings in front of the bathroom mirror, drilling the same correction, until the body finally decided it was the body's idea. The seagull on Connolly's sword, and Connolly's complete equanimity about the seagull, the brief economy of a man who has learned not to give unnecessary attention to things that cannot be controlled. Marcus Webb's voice in the corridor. You are a pillar. Pillars don't experience things. His mother at the checkout, doing the same discipline for 30 years without it having a name. His father's voice on the phone going quiet when it needed to be quiet. The coach 12 feet from where he stood. He thought about all of it with the measured and unsentimental attention of a man who has carried something significant and is now setting it down carefully, not discarding it, but placing it where it can be held without needing to be actively managed. He arrived at the hospital at 2:15 in the afternoon. His father was on the 2nd floor in a room that had had 2 other beds occupied when George Harlow had first arrived, and now, this Tuesday afternoon, had both of them empty, so it was just George in his own pajamas, the blue ones with the white stripe that Daniel had known his whole life, sitting up in the bed, looking out at the car park and the rooftops beyond it. He turned when Daniel came through the door and looked at him in the way that fathers look at sons after a period of not seeing them, the quiet inventory of what has changed and what has held. He said, "You look thin." Daniel pulled the visitor's chair to the side of the bed. He said, "You look better than I was expecting." His father said, "I look terrible, and the mirror in the bathroom here is very clear on the subject." They talked as the Harlow men had always talked, approaching what mattered by way of what didn't require as much: the hospital food and the quality of the television reception in this room compared to the room next door, and the nurse named Paula, who his father had decided was very good at her job despite her views on the bathroom situation. It was comfortable conversation, the comfort of a pattern established over 24 years, two people who knew each other's rhythms well enough that they did not need to announce them before using them. Then his father reached for the remote from the blanket beside him and turned on the small screen above the window. He said, "I've been watching it when I can't sleep. They keep replaying it. On the screen, the mall, the procession, the long line of guardsmen in their bearskins, standing at their positions on both sides of the route, the crowd on both sides, the cavalry, and then the coach advancing slowly up the road in the gray morning light." Daniel sat in the visitor's chair and watched the footage that he had been inside 2 days ago, watching it now from the outside, from the version of it that television presents to everyone who was not on the street, the version with the color and the scale and the sense of something enormous and composed and historic, with all the cold and the rain and the weight of the bearskin and the 3 hours and 22 minutes edited into the clean image of a great occasion. His father leaned forward. He studied the line of guardsmen on the screen with careful and systematic attention, the attention of a man looking for something specific in a picture where all the things of the same kind have been deliberately made to look identical. His eyes moved along the formation from one end toward the other. He was looking for his son. He pointed at the screen. "There," he said. Daniel looked. His father was pointing at a guardsman near the left edge of the formation. The guardsman was tall and standing correctly with the bearskin at the right height and everything in its required place. He was not Daniel. He was not from Daniel's battalion or Daniel's section of the route or anywhere near the stretch of mall where Daniel had stood for 3 hours and 22 minutes 2 days before. He was a different man entirely, standing in his own position on a different part of the route, wearing the same uniform and holding the same position, and his connection to the Harlow family of Stoke-on-Trent was only that he was on the screen at the moment George Harlow decided he had found his son. Daniel looked at his father's face. George was still pointing at the screen. His face had the look it took on rarely, the look that appeared when something arrived at a size larger than he had expected, and he was holding it with the particular care of a man managing a feeling he does not often allow himself to have in company. He was looking at this stranger with the warmth and the attention that belonged to Daniel and had been built over 24 years and had nothing at all to do with which specific body was occupying which specific square meter of the mall. Daniel could correct it. He knew exactly what the correction would look like. He could say, "No, Dad, that's not the right section. Let me show you. I was further along the route. Wait for the camera to move, and I will point to where I actually was." He could provide the factual, accurate, geographically correct version. He looked at his father's face. He said nothing. He let his father keep the guardsman he had chosen, this other man who had become, for this afternoon, in this hospital room in Stoke-on-Trent, the representative of everything George Harlow was proud of. He let the wrong man stand in for the right one, because the pride had never been looking at the uniform in the first place, and would not have been 1 degree different if his father had pointed at the right section of the route. And George Harlow said it. He said it with his finger still on the screen and his voice in the quietest register it had, the register without anything around it, without preparation or ornamentation. "I'm proud of you, son." Daniel felt the words arrive differently from how they had arrived on the phone 3 weeks before. On the phone, they had been wrapped in context, in the weight of the choice he had just made, and the hospital sounds, and the distance, and the complicated feeling of a son who has chosen the institution over the man who made him, even when that choice is understandable and right. On the phone, the words had been real, and he had known them to be real, and he had felt them, but they had come through layers. Here, now, in this room, they came through nothing. They arrived without the uniform, and without the ceremony, and without the question of what it means for a person from a particular kind of family to stand guard at a ceremony that families like theirs had, for generations, experienced from the outside looking in. They arrived without any of the weight that had been accumulating since a letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in February, and everything had become something larger than any one person. They were just one man saying them to another man. A father in a hospital bed and a son in the visitor's chair on a Tuesday afternoon in May, with the car park outside the window and the curtain rail slightly off-center and the television playing quietly above their heads. Daniel said, "Thanks, Dad." He said it for all the things that could not be said in their own words. For 22 years in the factory, and the clay dust in the creases of the hands. For the chair beside the hospital bed when Daniel was 11 and could not sleep for the pain in his arm, and the hand that squeezed his at intervals through the night, and the voice that said, "All right, lad, all right." For the showing up to the rugby matches where Daniel had not been very good, and the sitting in the cold stand watching something not very good, without once suggesting that a better use of the afternoon was available. For the phone call 3 weeks ago, when the voice had gone quiet in the way it went quiet when the most important thing was being said. For pointing at the wrong guardsman and feeling the right thing, because the pride had never been addressed to the uniform. The pride was for the fact of it, for the son who had been somewhere on that street, holding something that did not show, and which square meter of pavement was a detail the pride did not require. George lowered his hand from the screen. He leaned back against his pillow. He looked at Daniel with the direct attention he used sparingly, without the angles. He said, "I always knew you'd find something worth doing properly." Daniel said, "You never told me that." His father said, "You knew it anyway." Probably true. He usually was, about the things he said only once. Patricia arrived at 3:30 with a large flask of soup made at home that morning, and a smaller flask of tea, and the energetic and practical manner she brought to every situation that called for managing, which was every situation she had ever encountered. She embraced Daniel in the doorway with both arms and held on for longer than she usually did, and he understood from the duration of it and from the particular quality of the holding everything that the past 3 weeks had been, the calls and the not knowing and the steady management of a man who did not believe his own cardiac event constituted a sufficient reason to disrupt anyone's plans. She laid out the soup in the containers she had brought, because she did not trust the hospital's version. She talked, and George occasionally interrupted with corrections to the factual record. Daniel sat between them in the visitor's chair and ate the soup and watched the replay still playing on the screen above the window, the procession still moving through the gray London morning, enormous and composed and indifferent, in the specific way that great occasions are indifferent, to the individuals standing inside them. His father fell asleep mid-sentence at some point, his hand resting open on the blanket. Patricia watched him sleep for a moment. She said quietly, not to anyone in particular, "He always sleeps well when there's nothing left to worry about." It was the most she said, directly, about the past 3 weeks. It was enough. Daniel took the 7 o'clock train back to London. He sat in the window seat and watched England move through the dark outside the glass. The orange lights of towns in the middle distance. Each one a building where something ordinary was happening that had nothing to do with any of what had just occurred. Just people. Just the entirely ordinary and entirely enormous business of being alive in a particular place on a particular night. He thought about his grandfather, who had marched in 1984 and had come home and had not talked about it much, and whose silence on the subject had a specific and recognizable weight to it, the weight of something that had mattered and had not been acknowledged and had not ended as it should have, and who had kept going and kept showing up and had passed something down through the family without giving it a name or a description or any particular instruction about what to do with it. He thought about what you inherit from people who do not put names on what they are giving you. He thought about the capacity for stillness he had found in himself on the parade ground in February, which had not been invented by the army and had not come from nowhere. It had been demonstrated to him every day of his life by two people who had never once described what they were doing as discipline or training or something that cost them anything to sustain. He thought about Marcus Webb saying, "You already knew what kind of man you were before any of this started." He was not entirely sure that was the right way to say it. He thought it was closer to say that you inherited a direction from the people who shaped you, and then the choices you made, particularly the choices you made under pressure, were the ones that confirmed whether the inheritance had taken hold. You did not decide the direction. You decided whether to follow it, when following it was not the easy option. His had taken hold. The 6 months had confirmed it. The 11 evenings at the mirror. The choice he made in Price's office. The 3 hours and 22 minutes on the mall in the rain. All of it had confirmed something that had been building since before he joined the army, since before he left Stoke, since his mother sat down in the kitchen chair at the end of a long day and asked how everyone else's day had gone. He thought about the Gold State coach passing 12 feet from where he stood. He thought about the specific quality of knowing it was there without looking at it directly. He thought about the child in the red raincoat who had waved a flag at him until she stopped, and what it must look like from outside to wave at something that does not wave back, and how the outside and the inside of any action are two different countries, and sometimes you live entirely in one while the other sees only the surface. He thought about his father in the hospital bed pointing at the wrong guardsman and saying he was proud. He thought, it doesn't matter which one he pointed at. The pride had never been addressed to the guardsman. The pride was for the fact of it, for the son who had stood somewhere on that street and held the thing that needed holding. Which square meter was a detail. The holding was what was being acknowledged. The holding was what had always been being acknowledged, in all the ways that George Harlow acknowledged things, without direct statement, without ceremony, through the quiet and reliable fact of showing up. Outside the window, the lights of a town appeared and slid away. Tomorrow he would be on the square at 5:47. There would be other duties, other rehearsals, other long mornings in the cold. The household division did not pause between occasions. The standard did not rest. The work continued because that was its nature, and Daniel was at peace with this because it was also his nature, and the two had been confirmed as belonging together by 6 months of mornings and 1 afternoon in a hospital room in Stoke, and 2 words that had been large enough to hold everything else inside them. He watched England in the dark. The bearskin was in its cabinet. The square would be ready. The standard had not moved. Neither had Daniel Harlow, from the moment he had sat on the edge of his bunk with a letter in his hands and understood that something real was beginning, to the moment he sat in a train with the darkness outside the window and the ordinary world moving past in the orange lights of the towns, carrying everything that had happened inside the stillness that was the only thing most people had ever been able to see. He thought about what it meant to be in something without being seen inside it. He had been thinking about this since the mall, since the 3 hours and 22 minutes, since the coach had passed 12 feet away and the crowd had made its sound and he had held everything inside the stillness that was all anyone from the outside could see. He thought about how many things in a life were exactly like this, were the holding of something that showed nothing on the surface, the management of what was real on the inside so that the outside could continue to function as required. His mother at the checkout. His father at the machine for 22 years. He had grown up inside people who were doing this every single day, who had been doing it before he was born and who would have been doing it even if he had never come along to observe it. He had taken it for granted the way you take for granted anything that is simply the landscape of your childhood, without recognizing that the landscape is itself a teaching, that the things you learn before you know you are learning anything are the deepest things you will ever know. The army had given him a structure for it. The army had given him a vocabulary, a schedule, a standard, a line to hold. But the capacity had been there before the army. It had been there in the kitchen chair and the checkout and the factory and the chair beside the hospital bed at 2 in the morning. It had been assembled by people who had not called it assembly and had not known they were building something, who had simply been doing what the situation required, and had, in the doing of it, produced a person who could stand on a mall in the rain for 3 hours and 22 minutes and hold. He was grateful for this in a way he did not have the right words for yet. He thought he would find the words eventually. He thought perhaps the words were less important than the understanding that the gratitude was there. He watched England in the dark outside the window. The landscape was invisible now, all of it below the level of the light, reduced to the orange punctuation of the towns and the occasional white headlights of cars moving on roads parallel to the train line. He had always found this stretch of the journey peaceful in a way he couldn't fully account for. The hour between London and Stoke, where the world outside was dark and the train was its own small world, and he could be completely neither the person who had left nor the person who had not yet arrived. He thought about what he would do tomorrow and the day after and the weeks and months beyond that. He thought about the duties and the rehearsals and the 5:47 mornings and the standard that did not move. He thought about all of it not with dread or with particular eagerness, but with the steady and even attention of a man who has found the work that his capacities were built for, who has been confirmed in the finding by the test of something large and real. He closed his eyes. The train moved on through the dark. In a hospital in Stoke-on-Trent, a man slept with his hand resting open on a blanket, dreaming of nothing in particular, certain in the quiet and unshakable way of a father who has pointed at a screen and found his son there, certain that the thing he was proud of was real, which it was, and was his, which it also was, regardless of which man in a bearskin hat he had chosen to point at. Both of them were his son. One of them always had been.